Welcome everyone. My name is Hallie Caldwell and I am a part of the Inspira Advantage team. I have two fantastic consultants here with us today who are going to walk us through the AMCAS Work and Activities section, the true story. Inspira Advantage is a med school consulting company where we help students plan for their med school applications, help write personal statements, go through work and activities section, complete primary, secondary applications, really every part of the med school application process. And our two panelists here today are some of our wonderful team that help clients go through that process. So thank you all for being here. We have Aditya and Chiamaka here today. Aditya, can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, hey everyone. Thanks for attending our talk today. So my name is Aditya. I am currently a PGY2 first year radiology resident at Mayo Clinic in Rochester and went to medical school at Mayo Clinic in Arizona.
Great. Thanks so much for being here. And Chiamaka, can you introduce yourself?
Hi, you all. Thank you for coming. My name is Chiamaka. I am a rising fourth year medical student at Dartmouth, and I've been a part of admissions for going now 3 years, and I've been a part of the Inspire family for a few years too. I'm really happy to be here.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you both for being here. It's always a pleasure to have you. So we'll dive in. We just went through some introductions, but we'll talk about the purpose of the work and activity section, go through the format, talk about the anatomy of Standout, work and activity sections. We'll go through some tips, and then we'll open things up for a Q&A. So if you have any questions as we go through this, feel free to pop your question into the Q&A chat, and we'll get to those at the end. So what's the purpose of the work and activities section?
Yeah, so I can start off. So the AMCAS work and activities section is pretty much the standardized part of the application that goes along with the personal statement and the recommendation letters and everything. Pretty much it's like a very formatted version of your CV. You have to put all your work experience, extracurriculars, and volunteer experience. And you have to list everything with a little bit more detail than you do in a usual CV. They'll ask for a number of hours you worked, any achievements. They'll give you a little bit of a text box description so that you can give like a very brief, succinct description of what you did. And this is kind of what admissions committees use instead of a personal CV to see everything that you've done when applying.
Great. Chiamaka, do you have anything else to add here?
I just like to add that many students, really focus on their personal statements, but then cut corners when it comes to this work and activities section. Many students are unaware that this work and activities section usually shows up ahead of your personal statement. And as an admissions committee member, usually sometimes I'm reading and getting to know you through this work and activities section before I get to your personal statement. So this aids as a first impression. It's this summary of your CV or this elaboration of your CV. So whereas your personal statement allows you to describe a more personal professional experience that really led you into medicine, this activity section discusses like the day-to-day work you put in to get you to this point of application.
Thank you for that additional information. That's great. I think it's something not a lot of people know. All right. So what does the format of this section look like?
So, a good thing with the MCAS section is that you're typically allowed to describe up to 15 experiences. And in these 15 experiences, you usually would only have like a 700 character limit, including spaces. Most people might be like 7 characters. I did a lot. How can I describe myself in 700 characters? if you were already putting together a CV beforehand, and this goes for residency application, job applications, this is something that you should be doing regardless professionally. But if you kept your CV up to date and you wrote some of the highlights of each of your activity, writing up the 700 character limit should not be as bad. That said, 3 of those experiences can be designated as most meaningful, where you can further expand on them in a separate section with a 1,325 character limit. So that's just like a breakdown of the general format for your work and activity section.
Great.
Yeah, and
sorry, go ahead,
yeah, sorry.
Aditya.
Thanks. There was a good point brought up about the CV. So that is something that's definitely important as well. If you're just about to apply and you don't have a CV, maybe it might be worth some time just putting together a preliminary one first to get your ideas for this. But the other thing is, when you're asking for letters of recommendation, a lot of your letter writers will say, okay, I'm happy to do so. Why don't you send me a CV along with, statement of interest, something that you want me to focus on. And so just having that on board, on hand, will make the entire application process a lot easier, not just this work activity section.
I agree.
That's a great tip. So let's talk about the categories of work and activities. There is no shortage of them here.
Yeah, there are a lot of categories, and instead of kind of going through each and every one, it's just important to have your activities in the proper classification, and they're just kind of looking for different things. And if I were to kind of break this down and explain it to someone, the key things that people will be looking for in an application, if you're going to like an academic program, do you have a lot of research experience? So maybe like a research activity should be there, a volunteer activity should be there, some clinical stuff. And then they have some breakdowns after that. If you've had any sort of publications or posters, it's really important to try and keep track of all those. And it could be really hard to do that right before the application. The best thing to do would be to write down everything as you've done it into like a master CV, and then you can again just pull and throw things into this application as you can.
Great. Go ahead, Chiamaka. Sorry.
I think just to so you can only choose one of these categories for each of your activities. And I think one of the things I've seen some pre-meds fall into is, I don't know, like this, I was paid for this, but it was non-medical, but it was also a hobby, but it was also a leadership experience. So I find that which is reasonable, you start to split hairs on what category can I put this activity under. It's always best to see how best you can stretch yourself in terms of making sure that you're seen as a candidate who's dabbled in a lot in most of these things. Like, you've been a leader, you've also done non-medical stuff. So if you find that most of your activities are being categorized under one thing, it would be best to take a step back and think, okay, maybe I've had 5 experiences that are medical community service related. Can this also fall into an extracurricular activity? Maybe I should move one of them into an extracurricular.
That's a great tip. It sounds like a lot of them will overlap. So it's a strategy game to best place them.
Yeah, place them.
Do either of you have any tips? I know you just gave kind of an overview of that, but any specific tips on how to do that? Or any goals? I think you mentioned that you should be trying to show as many of these as possible, but is there a golden number or anything you should be aiming for there?
So I feel like this category, when it becomes important, is in the initial screening phase. So most medical schools are getting thousands of applications, and they need to hoard and limit your interviews. Your goal as an applicant is to get an interview. Obviously, that's because we're talking about your application right now. when the screeners go in, when they look at your application, usually they have like a form of formula in mind. They're thinking, okay, this person has this breadth of like, they have leadership skills and they have extracurriculars and they have this medical community service and they have an employment at some point and presentations. They look like a complete applicant who's done the work as a pre-med person for a medical school application. So you've ticked all the boxes. There's no real glaring red flag that you've missed out on community service or leadership or mentorship or any of that. So that's when they would usually be like, okay, maybe we should get this person into our interview pile. So just to reiterate, making sure you get most of these categories done is just for the initial screening process. When someone like me or someone else ends up, okay, now you've gotten invited for an interview, when I'm reading your application, I'm not going around with my list and saying, this person has 5 medical stuff and 5 conferences and 2 hobbies. I wonder if this is someone I want. No, at that point, I'm looking at you holistically to see if everything you've listed comes together in a coherent story. So most people get pigeonholed into making sure that they check each individual box. It's important to check boxes. I would not lie to you that it's not, because when I've seen people who didn't get in, even if they interviewed or they didn't get any interviews, the one thing that keeps coming back is that I don't think they had enough clinical community service. I don't think they had enough leadership. I don't think they had enough tutoring. Most of those things, like those glaring things that you're missing in those categories, start to come up. But once you have an interview, I've never heard someone say, well, they didn't have enough hobbies for me. They didn't have enough post presentation. It's like, I don't think their story came together coherently. So as much as you're ticking these boxes, make sure you're staying true to who you are.
Great. Aditya, anything to add there?
No, I agree with those points as well. It's mainly for like a screening thing, and seeing that you have all the categories needed to be a well-rounded applicant. And then after that point, you have your opportunity to shine by sharing your personal story in an interview.
Great. So, what to include in your descriptions?
What to include? So when you get to the AMCAS application section, they're definitely going to ask you for, hourly duration. Some people are always worried, like if you've been doing something for years and you're worried that the hours you put into that is going to look inflated, or if you've been doing something for such a short time and you're worried that the hours you're going to put in are not going to be looked down upon, like, oh, they only did 2 hours of this, why would they put this in your application? At the end of the day, yes, there are 2 things that people are looking for when they look at an application for a work or activity section. It's 1, how impactful was this to you, to your community, and to your story? And then 2, what does this say about you as an applicant, right? The duration. So if you've been doing something for 2 years or 3 years, what that says to me is that this person can stick through a project. This person can stick through in an organization. This person can stick through and get things done. This person is someone that would just hop in and leave when there's a sign that it's not working out, right? But if it's like a 3-year commitment on something that you were not very passionate about, I can read through and I don't see any impacts that this made. Some people have done something that were like a week long that seemed very impactful, and the way they spoke about it spoke to the reader a lot more than something they've been doing for 3 years. So just to say that whatever you're putting for your duration, make sure you're being truthful. Like if it's 15 hours, 100 hours of work, put it as 1,500 hours of work. Don't be scared that people are going to think it's inflated or deflated. Put in your best estimation of the duration you spent on the activity. Just so you know that there is a format where when we look at an application, we can map out how long each activity section is. And there's kind of a timeline things like, okay, this person started in 2014 and there's an overlap with this activity and that activity, and this is like the duration they've done. So I can go back and look like, oh, this person did 1,500 hours of community service and they did 500 hours of leadership. I can get a sense of who you are as an applicant. But that shouldn't scare you. You should be truly truthful, because at the end of the day, it's how any of that becomes a coherent statement. I always tell people, yes, you want to always state what was your responsibilities, what were your accomplishments, what was your impact, why is this relevant to your medical education. And this is like a skill I always find. Most people write this like, they write their AMCAS activity section as, okay, this is a hobby. I played volleyball since I was 2, and I was the volleyball leader in 2015, and it was great. Thank you. Compared to when someone comes to me and they write out a statement of, I remember when my coach came to me and told me I was going to be the leader of the team. And I just remember being like, they tell me a story on their activity. Yes, they're not using their 700 character to really give me a CV and pack a punch of, this is every single thing I accomplished during this, but they drew me in with a story and made me really interested in them and in this activity, so that now when I interview them, I can ask them a question on that. So when you're writing this, obviously every single activity shouldn't just be a story, but make sure that you're not just giving me bullet points or giving people like a long paragraph where like we're reading 500 applications. Sometimes people are busy clinicians, like they're reading this like right before your interview or after a long day and they have your kids or they don't have your kids. You really want to be making sure that some of your activities has a story to tell that draws your reader in.
Great. Aditya, anything else to add here?
No, I think that was great. I think it was really good insight into what the other side is looking at.
All right, let's talk a little bit more about how to talk about meaningful experiences and how that's different than the other general descriptions that you can have.
Yeah. So we talked about every single activity section gets about 700 characters. On top of that, you do have the option of choosing 3 of those experiences as meaningful experiences. So since they're meaningful, they'll give you about double the amount of space to kind of talk about them. And because there's double the amount of space, a lot of people might just start telling more facts. This is what happened. This is what I did. But I think what they're really looking for with meaningful experiences is the why and some form of reflection in those descriptions. So just in general, as Chimaka had given a really good story about, how someone found their volleyball hobby to be very impactful. They're kind of looking for you to show the why or some self-reflection in everything. But since there's so much information on this application, if you're going to do it somewhere, you should definitely do it in these meaningful experiences. And the other thing I want to point out is, when we're going through all these applications, or like when you're filling out the application, you can be pretty tunnel vision, say, okay, I'm going to work on this section next. Now I'm going to work on the personal statement. You have to keep in mind a bird's eye view that it's one whole application that someone is reading, right? So everything's kind of has to be in sync, right? So whatever you talk about in your personal statements, I assume those will be your meaningful experiences, right? Those should probably be the meaningful experiences that are the ones you select on the AMCAS as well. And it might be a little noticeable or a little odd if your meaningful experiences are you check 3 meaningful experiences on the AMCAS application and you don't end up ever talking about any of them in the personal statement. And that might throw someone off or have someone ask a question or two about what exactly is it that drew you to apply to this school and apply to this field. So that's just another tip about, making sure you have a bird's eye view about everything. So for example, like one of mine was the 2 that I can remember off the top of my head were when I was a hospice volunteer. And so everyone knows what entails being a hospice volunteer. So I used most of that section to talk about what my relationship was with the patient I was dealing with and what did I learn and how did I mature from that sort of experience. And then another one that's a little bit more technical was research. Again, I tried to not tell too much about the research details. It was a computational neuroscience lab, but I tried to talk more about why was it that I did that? What skills did I learn? What do I hope to do with this in the future? So it was more of kind of talking as if I'm talking to a friend, why was this meaningful to me, and what did I take away from these activities?
Thank you. That's great. Chimaka, anything else to add here?
No, just really reiterating, like, reflection is key. Reflection shows maturity and growth. So, exactly, make sure. I think most times you're not reinventing the wheel. I love your example on most people know what a hospice volunteer is. Most people know that if there's certain things you just mentioned on your resume, being a scribe, most people know what that is. So you don't want to use that space to start explaining what that is. Instead, use that space for reflection.
Great. So the anatomy of a standout AMCAS work and activities section. So let's talk a little bit about the core competencies that AMCAS talks about.
So this is an interesting subtopic. So the AMCAS list 4 core competencies: your intrapersonal meaning how did you work with others, right? So service orientation, your social skills, your cultural competence, teamwork, oral communication, and then your interpersonal. Your interpersonal is, what's your sense of ethics, right? To yourself, to others, to your teammates, to your patients, to your classmates, to anyone you're going to be coming in contact with. Like, how do you show that you're a reliable, dependent, resilient, adaptable person? Because that's the kind of candidate we're looking for. How have you shown a capacity for improvement? And then another core competency is your thinking and reasoning. We're not just looking at your CAR score. Your AMCAS work and activity section can tell us if you're a critical thinker, if you're someone who is interested in scientific inquiries, if you're someone who is interested in written communication, and then science, right? Are you interested in human behavior, learning about living systems? Let me tie this all together using an example. So if you're writing that I mentored people, so underemployment, you worked for 2 years in a role, right? And when you're talking about that role, you say that in that role, you worked as a team, you were very good at communicating, you really showed that you were very resilient with the fast changing role that they gave you. And in that role too, you took on the mantle to be this critical thinker, and you ended up like adding something to your teammates, right? So you've shown these 4 competencies, or at least 3 of them, in just one of that AMCAS section. So when you're thinking about your AMCAS section and you're thinking of what activities, you'll be fortunate enough if you have more than 15 activities, then now your problem is, which of my activities should I get into, or should I put down in my AMCAS section? Think of the activities that show you in these 4 core competencies as a whole, right? But regardless, even if you don't have all 15 activity, most people don't have all 15 activities. So don't sweat, don't panic if you don't end up having 15 of them. But it's like every single activity, how can I show these 4 core competencies? Or at least how do I show one of the 4, 2 of the 4, 3 of the 4? It's going to really help you in your brainstorming section.
Yeah, if I could, yep.
Yeah.
Sorry, yeah. If I could add in there, I also want to reiterate the point. You don't need all 15. Having 15 activities where you've done 10 hours total of each activity is not going to be as good as 3 or 4 activities where you've spent the core amount of your time outside of the classroom. And it's about the story that you craft. Basically, these 4 core competencies, this seems like from AMCAS presents this as, okay, this is what we're looking for. If we could boil this down even more, the question I'd like to pose is, for anyone listening, think of in your head what your ideal physician looks like. What does that ideal physician look like? And then I want you to notice that when you're thinking about those things, never once do they tell you, hey, I'm your ideal physician. They're just showing you, right? You're just thinking of how they are as a person, and they're showing you that this is what it means to be an ideal physician. So in the same way, you need to think, okay, like I shouldn't, in this application, I shouldn't be telling people, hey, I'm going to be an ideal physician. I'm going to be an ideal medical school student. You need to show them. So the way you present your activities and everything should be a demonstration of, hey, this is my hint to you that I can make it. I'll be a really good physician if you give me the shot.
Mm-hmm. I totally agree.
All right. So
you're showing them, you're showing them instead of telling us, you're showing us, right? That is such a profound thing. I hope you all would take away from today. You really want to show them that you're the perfect candidate for them instead of just telling them.
I think that applies kind of all stages of the med school application process and interviews, personal statements, really across the board. I think that's something we tell folks. So choosing and defining your meaningful experiences.
Yeah, so this is something we kind of touched on a little bit earlier. Again, one thing to note is everything should be in sync in your application. So if you end up working on your personal statement first, you've probably already thought about which experiences are the ones you want to include. And those are probably going to be the experiences that you mark as meaningful in your AMCAS application as well. If you're having trouble figuring out what your meaningful experiences are, again, maybe it might be good to kind of pluck yourself out of this med school application mode and maybe have like a conversation with a friend or something like that, where you're in a casual setting and you just talk about your application. You try to talk to someone, and then hopefully from there you'll be able to organically come up with, these are probably the experiences that I'm leaning most towards. And probably the ones that you spent the most time on are probably going to be the ones that are the most meaningful to you. Those are the ones that have kept drawing you in. And there's not one ideal sort of applicant. Some applicants may be research heavy, and that's what they want to do, and it's okay to have more of those be your meaningful applications. Some applicants may have done a little bit of research, but their true passion is in volunteering and serving their community, and so that's a different scope that they had. Again, it's about a story and about showing how you can contribute to the field. So it's not necessarily that everyone needs to do everything good at all times, because that's not really sustainable as you grow into this career. So just trying to figure out, what is your story, what's your voice, what really attracts you. Those are the things that you should mark as your most meaningful experiences.
Thank you. Maka, anything else here?
No. I know that the more coming.
Great. So choose a little bit more on choosing and defining your meaningful experiences.
So when you are considering I totally agree. So every candidate has a different things that mean a lot to them. Some candidates are really very interested in research, and some candidates are interested in volunteer activities. You don't want to choose a meaningful activity that you think would score you the most brownie point. You don't want to choose a meaningful activity that, for example, I'm going to say research, because research sounds like something that anyone who is reading it would be like, well, that's a researcher. No. Think of your meaningful activity as a chance to further show them what type of candidate you're going to be in medical school, what you're completely passionate about, right? So if you're someone who is like completely passionate about advocacy work, and 2 out of 3 of your meaningful experiences show me that, if I'm someone who feels that my school can nurture you to be a student advocate, a physician advocate, I would love you as a candidate. And guess what? You would love to end up here too. So it's a two-way street where you're really trying to be like, these are things I find meaningful. Do you also find this meaningful? That's it. It's not what you think would score any of those brownie points, because 4 years is a long time. Most medical schools in the United States that are accredited are good medical schools that will get you to that MD or that DO eventually and get you to be a practicing physician. You ultimately want to find a place that has the best fit for you. So your meaningful activity should be something that you care about, so you have the best chance to match with a school that also cares about those things. So think of your meaningful activity as, one, that connection, what do I care about, and which of those activities gave me the most transformation? Where was I the most transformative as an applicant, right? Because most people use their personal statements to talk about their transformation, but a meaningful activity section can also be a good way to show this is my resilience story. This is my I'm a go-getter story. This is my passion project story. That's where you put that in.
Fantastic. Aditya, anything else here?
No, nothing else to add on this slide. And I think with this slide as well, essentially what Chiamaka had already said, just focus on the experiences that have transformed you the most. Don't try to cherry pick and think what programs will like, because it's really hard to know what they're looking for. It could be something different every year, and they're choosing 50 to 100 something applicants. They're not looking for the same applicant for all 150, right? So you might have something unique that might be hidden because you tried too hard to figure out what they wanted. Just be true to yourself, and hopefully things will happen from there. We can just move on to the next slide. I think this is pretty much just formal quotations from AMCAS of what we were discussing. And then the thing that we'll just kind of touch more upon is writing impactful and effective descriptions. So again, this is kind of the most subjective part of this whole section, but it is the one where it is the most important. So some keywords that have already popped up: self-reflection is key. That's definitely one thing. Show, not tell. That's also another thing that is key. And again, if it's something that everyone is very familiar with, like a scribe, you don't need to tell me I was a scribe in the ED. My responsibilities were writing notes for all the ER patients. I shadowed a lot of patients. I got to talk to a lot of patients. Like, that sort of description doesn't really tell me anything aside from, what you did. So essentially, like, whatever job description you got, that should not be what you put into your application. I've seen sometimes like that kind of be like a shortcut, and that is kind of wasting the space, in my opinion, because you're not giving an opinion of what's happening. So I can give a personal example. Again, let's talk about me being a hospice volunteer. It's something that everyone's aware of what it is. It's people who are at the end of life, and you spend time with them and try to give them some company. So what I focused on, and that was one of my meaningful experiences, what I focused on in that description was more of how it affected me and what did I learn from that experience. So what I talked about was that, the power of one-on-one connection is something that can be used kind of as a healing tool as well. He was near kind of his deathbed, but I noticed that these meetings that I had with him were some of the most exciting parts of his week that he really looked forward to. And I also learned as well how to best talk to patients or talk to people who are in difficult situations and not shy away from difficult topics. And if we can break that down, I didn't tell you anything about what a hospice volunteer is, because everyone knows what that is. And I kind of told you, okay, these are the things that I picked up. So in my head, if I were reading that from a program standpoint, I can say, okay, this guy is clearly reflecting on the activities that he's doing. He's picking up some very sophisticated communication skills that most people would not, really talk about unless they've truly like thought and went through that activity. And so kind of in the same frame, that's how you should look at all your applicant or all your activities as well. You should ask the question, what did I learn? Why did I do this? What is the thing that I remember the most from this activity?
Great. Amaka, anything else here?
I think the next bullet point expands on this. The next slide expands on this too. So what writing style should you use? before I read what's on the slide, I think just there's that conversation of, should this be a structured paragraph or should this be bullet points? I don't know if you have a different experience, Aditya, but most people write in paragraphs, and I've rarely ever seen people write this activity section in bullet points. So I would personally advise you to try to use just write out what you're thinking about as a full-on paragraph sentence. Like, I'm just going to write out what's going on instead of trying to give me bullet points, because you never know how the bullet point would translate when we end up getting it in our system. Just, I know that that's like always on people's minds. So yes, you want to be clear and you want to be concise. They're giving you 700 characters. There's not enough time for you not to be concise anyway. So they're doing that job for you by putting you in check on your conciseness. And most times your meaningful experience, 1,325 characters, including spaces, that is also not a lot of time and a lot of space for you to add things. But really, anything that you feel like isn't adding to your statement sentence, please take it out. Use complete sentences and ideas. Like, you want to ensure that your description as a paragraph, you won't have the option to use bullet points, like I said. So make sure each sentence communicates a full idea. And always, always tell a story as much as you can. But don't fall into the trap of telling a story for all 15 activities. Most people will be reading it and they'll be like, wow, they have a story for every single activity. You want to make sure that your story is impactful. So my personal advice is, please don't use it for every single one. Use it when they count, as much as possible when they count. Your description should present a narrative with a beginning, a middle, and a conclusion, and it should paint a cohesive picture of who you are as a competent candidate. This is one other thing I love to tell people, because this is something you're going to use forever when you're writing your CV, when you're writing your activity section, when you're ultimately going to be in medical school and writing your residency application. You always, always want to use action verbs, right? Verbs that express something that you've done. Most times, if you just go online and you search action verbs for CVs, action verbs for applications, you're going to find a lot of things, because a verb, the way you say you did things, for example, if you're a founder, right? If you're an implementer, there's certain words, there's 700 characters is so short. You want to make sure you're using these very impactful verbs to really state the things you're saying. So whenever you finish writing your AMCAS application and you're like, okay, I've written everything down, this goes for your resume, your CV, everything in your future, go back and say, the way I describe this, can I use a verb to make this a lot more powerful? And go to Google, go to people that have written about action verbs, and you're going to find like a lot of really good advice out there.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Great advice.
If I could add something as well, just for impact, I do like those action verbs. Definitely agree. And sometimes numbers can be impactful as well. There's a difference in first impression if you just said, oh, I tutored high school kids, or versus I tutored over 500 high school kids in my 2 years as a high school tutor, right? Because then you have actual numbers, and then when someone reads that, they're like, oh, that's actually a lot of people you tutored, instead of it just being 1 to 2. So use those as well, just to kind of give a better context into how extensive was the activity that you just did.
Yeah. I like that. I like that a lot. I think one other thing that crossed my mind was, so when you speak on, for example, the hospice idea, we keep going back to, a lot of people know what a hospice volunteer is, but we may not know what that organization is. I always find myself going back like, what was this organization again? When people are like, oh, I worked for Comfort Care of Lyme. And it's like, okay, what is Comfort Care of Lyme? So make sure that, I know it's taking space from those 700 characters, but you want to give a very, very, very brief description of what the organization is, just to paint a full picture of the work you did.
All right, so this is just a visual of the structure that we've kind of been talking about, but we can go through it briefly.
Yeah, yep. So we will look at this in 4 parts, and based off our discussion, if anything, if I could redo this slide again, I would kind of make the part 1, part 2, part 3, and part 4 like bigger and bigger as you go down, just to kind of emphasize that part 4 is where we would want to spend most of our time. But obviously, mention where you worked. If it's like a name that is like only people in that city or in that college would know, probably best not to use it. Just say you worked at a senior care center, you worked for this volunteer organization. Very briefly, I did this role. I worked in this context, and then part 4 is where you should mainly dedicate maybe like 1-2 sentences. Like, this is what I learned. This is the type of experience that I had. This is how I found out I truly enjoy this thing, or I truly enjoy this aspect of that activity. And again, it's the first 3 parts are just to give context. It's not really to just talk about that, because if you talk too much about that, you'll kind of lose your opportunity to have that activity stand out. And back to Chiamaka's point before, having a story for everything, you just got to think about it as like, sometimes it can be stretching it. Like it can be very noticeable when you're trying to stretch something. Like if it's something that you've only done for 2 weeks for a max of 10 hours, and you're telling me, from here I found out the power of communication. Like we can tell that's a stretch. So, you got to pick and choose which activities are the ones that you've truly learned something from, and those are the ones you should target.
Great. Amaka, anything else here?
No, I completely agree. I think the worst thing you can try to do is try to seem, because I know most people aren't doing that. Most people are just nervous. They want to put forth a good application, but you just never want to seem like you're trying to be more than you are, or you're trying to one up the person reading your application, right? I think it goes into sometimes when people add a paragraph at the end of your personal statement on, oh, this is why I really want to come to Mayo Clinic, but nothing in your application screams you were specifically interested in Mayo Clinic, or you were specifically interested in Dartmouth. You just added one line to see if that will pique my interest. Just like, that's just an example. You always want to really stay true to yourself, because it would pay off. Because we're reading multiple applications. Some of us have been doing this for years. You just never like, that can just instantly be a killer for your application. So don't try to stretch an activity that should not be stretched.
All right, so we'll go on to some tips, and then from there we'll open things up for a Q&A.
I really like, the point that was raised on, your activity section should, especially your meaningful experience, your personal statement should have some expansion of that. You might not have the space or the time or the need to reintroduce your meaningful experience back in your personal statement. It's not like a 100% strategy that you should definitely do that. But if you're telling me that you're someone who research is meaningful to you, or advocacy is meaningful to you, or community service is meaningful to you, or working with immigrants is meaningful to you, or in general, pediatrics is meaningful to you, whatever it is you're telling me is meaningful to you, if there is a disconnect between your personal statement and that meaningful activity, that is a glaring flag that you just put in whatever you wanted for your meaningful activity. Because at the end of the day, there should be a coherence. I mean, it's you. It's really who you are. Who am I to you as a candidate? So you really want to make sure that there's that it's not just an expansion, there's that coherency between what your activity section is telling me, what your application is telling me, what your letters are telling me. You just want to make sure that you do not seem like you're a fraud, and there's that coherence coming together. Obviously, the trick is most people don't know. And that's fair, right? You want to be able to like say that I'm very interested. These are the things I'm interested in. These are the things I found meaningful. And I don't know what it would mean for me when I'm in med school, but I'm hoping that while in med school, I can become this and that and that. Hopefully. But if you're stating with certainty, there has to be a coherence. Make each word count, really make each word count. Like we said, for the structure, that part 4 is very important. That reflection is very important. So if you're looking for, if you have currency and you're hoarding your currency, where do I put my money down? Part 4 is where you put your money down. Quality over quantity, right? If you have 15, 200 AMCAS activities that were just 2 hours here and there, not showing any longevity, any commitment, no resilience, no scientific improvement, no leadership, no mentorship. You're just checking boxes. We're going to see through that. So you really, especially, I don't know where most of you are in this call, if you're already in application season, if you're prepping for application next year, but it's never too late for you to start thinking of the quality of the things you're going to put forward, not just the check boxes. Show, don't tell. I absolutely love that. You can tell me you're a resilient person, but if someone's like, I came to this country on my own, I had nothing, and obviously that's not everyone's story. That's just a story, an example. I had no one. I was a DACA recipient. I'm a first generation immigrant, and I came here and I got, I had a 3.8 GPA, and I worked for Project Salute, and I did this and I did that. You're showing me, you're not telling me, right? So your application should tell me who you are instead of you telling me. Because when I come to your interview and I tell you, who are you? Who are you as a candidate? And you're like, I'm a resilient person, I'm a caring person. That scores no brownie points for me if you're not showing me who you are. Always proofread. Always proofread. Most people in this day and age use Grammarly now. That's, if you've never heard of it, that's the tool you can always go to. It would check your grammar, but still, regardless, it's an AI service that tells you what to do. Like, your grammar is off here and there. It still doesn't take away from a human person reading your application, your activity, and telling you, does this make sense? Even more important, most people are thinking, oh, maybe this person should proofread it. No, sometimes going to your friends who know you, not only a proofread, does this sound like me? Most people forget that. Does this sound like me? Is this like would you say that this is who you think I am? I don't want to sell myself short.
Great. Thank you. Aditya, anything else here before we open up the Q&A?
Just something on the last point, something that I do with all my clients when I proofread is I always proofread out loud. So I will read it back to them, and that way I'll catch things that seem a little off, and they'll catch things that seem a little off. Both for grammar, for sentence flow, and then also for, oh wait, that was kind of too short of a description, or I wish we spent more time on that explanation. So that could be something you could do as well for proofreading, as well. When you're finished with these descriptions, read them out loud to yourself, have someone else read them out to you, and see what's missing, and then you can add that.
Great advice. All right. So Q&A. If you have any questions, pop them into the Q&A box. And in the meantime, Shimaka, Aditya, is there anything else that you feel like people need to know about the work and activity section that we didn't necessarily cover, or any other points you want to drive home?
I think it can be difficult to think of this as like writing your identity out, but in a sense that might make it a little bit easier, maybe a little bit more high stakes, hopefully not, but like this is essentially like you're putting your identity on paper and passing it along to the admissions committee. And so it's not just like a list of activities. It's so you need to deliberately focus on the things that you feel are actually you. And those are hopefully the things that will show up on the other side as the signals that they want.
That makes a lot of sense.
I think so far we've really reiterated on the things I learned while applying, using when I spoke to people who've gone through the application cycle. I really think that everything we've told you, I hope you take it with you. Really, if you put in most of these tips and tricks and some of the things I've told you, you will come out a better candidate for it.
Absolutely. We'll give folks another minute or two to add questions. This is a chance to ask experienced medical students really anything. Doesn't necessarily need to pertain to the work and activity section. So feel free to pop in any questions that you have. And in the meantime, I just want to say thank you all for joining. Aditya, Chiamaka, it's always a pleasure to have you both. Thank you for joining us today. And I think you guys gave really fantastic advice and insight. I'm not in the med school application process right now, but I feel like I have a good handle on the work and activity section. All right, so we have a question here. What are your recommendations for non-traditional students in terms of listing experiences? And if they held several roles throughout the course of an experience, which is changing job responsibilities or having distinct clinical versus leadership aspects of a single job, should that be split into different sections?
I would the safest answer is always case by case basis, but like if I'm trying to imagine what you're saying, so if you were like in one organization and you were like a clinical provider and then all of a sudden you went into like a management role, I would tell you to do two separate activities just because those are very distinct. And you could talk about those, I think, very extensively. If it was something like, you kept the same role, but like, after a couple months, they gave you an additional like informal responsibility. Maybe that would be the same activity. But if you have two distinct roles, I think that would be reasonable to have it be two different activities.
That was my first instinct too, reading that. Like, I believe that especially an employment activity where you've shown yourself and you've grown in your career and you've changed roles, you started from a subordinate position to maybe a leadership role now, and you had those changing roles, it's really fair game, and even more, it's important for you to make those two distinct roles, just so when someone's reading it, they can have a full sense of who you were before, when you started this role, and who you are now. And we would be able to read that timeline because you're going to state that it's the same company. We're going to see when it comes to like what organization it is and where you started, when you stopped, and when you started this role and when you stopped. Anyone reading that would be able to clearly make sense of that. When you're a non-traditional student, most times you usually end up with more than 15 activities because you've just done so much with your life. That's where really editing yourself comes in. For example, there's some people that they've done 5 shadowing opportunities. Do you want to list all 5 of them and use up all 5 of them as 5 activities? No, you don't. You want to be like shadowing, simply listing them. I know it would mean that you don't have time to like read what you've learned from any of those roles. That's fine. We know that there are other things that are probably more meaningful to you, given that you're a non-traditional student and you've done a lot more with your life. So I would say, so what are your recommendations for non-traditional students in terms of listing your experience? Edit yourself, right? Which of the experiences that you've had outside of medicine are not important to your med school application? Remove those. Which of those activities that are non-medical related but still show who you are as a person, especially given that you're non-traditional, you've lived a life, you've had experiences. We would love to hear that. We would love for you to add that. And what activities that would someone who is non-traditional highlight? That would be like, well, I have space. I would like to highlight that. That is just like adding fluff to your activity section. Take those out. So like when it comes to someone who is non-traditional, editing really, really becomes very important.
Awesome. Thank you both. All right. Well, I think we're just about at time, so we'll wrap up. Everyone who joined, thank you so much. You'll get an email with a recording of this webinar probably on Monday. And it'll also be up on our website. We have 2 more webinars coming up over the next 2 weeks. Feel free to register for those and be on the lookout for webinars coming mid-January. We'll be continuing to do weekly webinars, especially as we get into the thick of application season. And Amaka and Aditya, thank you so much for joining us. It's always great to have you. I hope everyone has a great evening.
Great. Thanks so much.
You get it, yeah.
All right. Thanks. Bye.